Okay, so good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to speak here. I'm an MD and I have some bias. I'm also a physician-botanist. Anesthesiology is my specialty. My fellowship of 40 plus years ago is in pain management, but back before they had subspecialty boards. So there was no such thing in those days as an interventional anesthesiology pain management fellowship or expertise, nor was there an addictionologist, which generally that whole field went the way of psychiatry. So I'm trained like a dinosaur with both, because many of the botanical medicines we'll cover today have an ugly side, a public health consequence side. So on that basis, if this is a CME, we've got to do this interesting obligatory attestation. And if you look down at the seventh item there, it says if I'm discussing any product use that's off-label, I'll disclose it that the use or indication in question is not currently approved by the FDA for labeling and advertising. Well, prohibited Schedule 1 substances are by definition off-label, so you can technically say everything I'm going to say is off-label because we're still talking about something that at this moment in time is Schedule 1 prohibited. That's going to change, and it's going to be one of the things we'll speak about. But I've tried to pull together a little of the hardcore science, a little bit of the political science, a little bit of where we've been as far as research and education, where it's going to go to, so that you sort of get a snapshot in time, because cannabis is not a moment in time. You can look at history and find that it's a process. The process in the United States for its illegality dates back to 1937 in the Marijuana Tax Act, which actually had the first state in the country, California, back in 1910 and 11, become the first state to go into prohibition. And the conditions and the causes there were very much associated with marijuana, which is a Mexican Spanish word associated with a vigilante named Pancho Villa, coming up not representing Mexican's government, but a vigilante group who was taking over U.S. soil and killing citizens. That really, if you think about it, was a very early terrorist attack on U.S. soil, close down the borders, vilify who's coming in. And it wasn't only from Mexico, they were coming from Asia, opioids coming in through Central and Northern California. So at that time in history, leading into the 1930s and world wars, we are getting very border closed mentality. Let's insulate ourselves from the rest of the world. So if that sounds more familiar, yes. Bottom line of the attestations, I've not received any commercial income, so I try to stay independent and scrupulously neutral. I invite your criticism if you hear otherwise. So this is a political cartoon that came out a decade ago. And I'm a member of the FMA. As a matter of fact, this same time, a few months before this, I was the only Florida physician asked to write the 8-hour CME that all physicians who wanted legally to see cannabis patients would first have to pass. That was published by the Department of Health in 2014. 2015, I was asked to do the rulemaking. So I got to be popular with people I didn't know. The thing that bothers me about this is that doc looks obviously bored. He's speaking in a way that's obviously not educated. And back in the days when OxyContin was all the scourge, now replaced with fentanyl. You understand how this kind of cartoon may have gotten under my skin, representing myself as a member of this group. Nevertheless, this prevailing theme for tonight's talk is that science and reason really do matter, reason being the justification to do it. So this in 2013, the year before, is what got me so interested to basically really hone down on what the federal government was looking at. And they were appropriately not looking at the plant directly. And I'm using this slide purposely. ECS, the bullseye, stands for endocannabinoid system. And I was just starting off speaking for a few minutes with Dr. Joseph about how that's really the target. And this was a paper in 2013 from the NIH, and it was actually a paper written by two MD, PhD researchers at the NIH. And their point is, and I tried to illustrate it in this picture of an archer, to have pure focus on the target, which is the endocannabinoid system, you should not think or otherwise gaze and look at cannabis as a good example of really what that system's designed to do and does. As any archer knows, if you start to gaze at something at the tip of your arrow, rather than being purely focused on the target, you're going to hit misses, shoot misses. So the actual paper is this paper. And 2013, I'm going to show you a statement highlighted here that I had never read anything as impactful as a anesthesiologist, which is a receptor-specific pharmacist and physiologist. You know the way drugs affect those receptors, what their normal function is. But this is the statement made in that report. Modulating endocannabinoid system activity may have therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans. This isn't coming out from some little rag report. This is the NIH, and they're saying this in 2013. At that point is, wow, tell me more. And I sort of dove headfirst into it, but it's not that hard. If I can understand this, so can everybody on this call tonight. And it's particularly important because it's coming up right around the corner, the rescheduling of cannabis that's been since 1970, a follow-up from the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, regarded as not having any known medical use, was the new term that they would have put in there in 1970, because that's what Schedule 1 includes of the Controlled Substances Act that started that year. And so if we're going to look at the plant critically and even compare it to other plants, I'm going to use some old pictures here because for hundreds of years, this is the way you would depict a plant, not only a botanical medicine. It has different stages of development, seeds you can see flowering and so on. But cannabis is really looked at by our government from two different lenses. The first to the left is the FDA, and they look at not only drugs, but Food and Drug Administration, which is why some foods try to get in the back door, including hemp-derived products that were changed as far as how they're classified in 2018 with the US Farm Bill. But the key is nutraceuticals or foods have a much lower standard than pharmaceuticals do. So in this case, the drugs would normally be entertained in the pharmaceutical realm for safety and efficacy, talking about use and abuse, while the other government agency, the Drug Enforcement Agency, looks at risks and benefits and then classifies something. If there are no benefits, it's prohibited, and that's one of the key definitions. And then obviously prohibited is different than controlled, and controlled substances are many. And here's though the definition for a Schedule 1 substance, and I've just underlined the key points. They should have a high potential for abuse, and that's kind of relative in terms of when you compare it to other things that are not prohibited for abuse. It has no currently accepted medical use. That's what's really changed, because it took a federally commissioned study in 2017 to get the DEA on an appeal from the Health and Human Services Committee from Biden administration to reconsider this scheduling. And in fact, it does have limited, but a few that are absolutely currently accepted medical uses. And finally, the last number there, a lack of accepted safety under medical supervision. Well, when it's illegal, you can't get it, you're breaking the law, can't research or educate on it because of Schedule 1, it makes that last thing kind of a impossible thing to do. So suffice it to say that with this strict definition, it's coming out of prohibition and will be rescheduled as a Schedule 3 substance, as are opium, poppy, there it yields the narcotics from the opium, it's fentanyl included, and cocaine. People think cocaine is a prohibited substance as well. It's not. It's used every day in ear, nose, and throat surgery in little plugets, because cocaine as a local anesthetic is the only local anesthetic that acts also as a vasoconstrictor. So if you're going to try to minimize bleeding and numb something up, it's actually a very effective drug for that. So its abuse potential is different, but no abuse potential really can match this plant, for which there are far more preventable deaths globally than any other plant in the world. And finally, I grow a lot of plants myself, legal ones, and in my own backyard, I have chocolate and coffee. And if you don't think those are dependence forming, I challenge you. Here, I wanted to point out the history of this a little bit, going back, and then we're going to go way back. But this is a tomb of a shaman in China from about 700 BC. And those two vessels on either side with the arrows had cannabis in it, but it wasn't simply cannabis leaves or twigs. They were the female cannabis flowers, which are known to have the greatest concentration of the bioactive chemicals. So even back then, they were regarded almost as a religious sacrament, of which was so important that people would be buried with it. It was that essential to their life, health, and wellness as interpreted in ancient cultures. And that's not the only culture. In the Middle East, you can still go to areas where there are some ancient fields. They're called landrace fields. They've stayed the same over millennia sometimes. And this is a good example in the Bekaa Valley of one where the plant actually evolved from more balanced plants, which had about the same amount of THC, the only major intoxicating substance in the plant, and cannabidiol, the one that's been more recently refound to have certain therapeutic benefits. For about a decade ago, it was when nothing else seemed to work in children, which unfortunately may have had intractable seizures. This seemed to make a difference. It does have other actions and few side effects, and those actions, particularly as an anxiolytic, seem interesting, lesser so as an anti-inflammatory. But I'm pointing out that the older plants that were around historically had different balances of chemicals. And I'm going to put on my botanist hat and ethnobotanist hat a little bit to try to tell you a little bit about why the plant today is not as balanced as back then. So I'm going to show you this slide. It's interactive and it's something with some animations in it. So suffice it to say that the slide I just showed you showed that old plants that humans had used for thousands of years, presumably successfully. Think about this. If a plant or an animal is so incompatible with one or the other, over time, if they're essential for survival and they don't work, they become extinct. So here we have old plants that had similar amounts before 1970 and the Controlled Substances Act. About everything got up to at most 4 to 5% of those cannabinoids. Mostly THC is what we're looking at, and that's why I'm showing you to the left the percentages of dry weight chemicals that are in there. Back then, 4% might be tops, but it had about the same of those two chemicals. What happened, though, after 1970, and I believe it's directly related to the constraints of prohibition, the modern plants started to emphasize those chemotypes. In the plant, chemotypes are cultivars that have a particular chemistry balance, where THC was really sought after and things were bred to be stronger and stronger year after year, crop after crop. And this shouldn't be surprising. The same thing happened to alcohol under its prohibition. Nobody's making money with weak beer and wine. They're selling spirits and moonshine. So what I'm pointing at is modern cannabis as it evolved since 1970 had the same constraints and is the moonshine equivalent with the similar Stills and Hills mentality of being grown. And maybe not in Appalachia like where the stills were, but in the Colorado Rockies. Sorry about the Appalachia comment there, Andy. Anyway, it's just a historical parallel that I like to make. There's some we'll make about tobacco and cannabis, which are inseparable. And now, of course, my little comment about prohibition on concentrates. So what happened then? After 1970, the plant started to change, and it was because of this. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Richard Evans Schultes. He's probably Harvard's foremost famous ethnobotanist. He's been dead for several years, but back in 1973, he explored Kandahar, Afghanistan, where the wars were after that. And at these 8,000-foot plateaus, he discovered this particular plant. Today, people call it more of the indica. Basically, it's got a lot of THC, and indica, some people use a little, mnemonic in the couch, but it is not a productive thing. It's sort of like one of those things that has also a lot of THC that impairs memory and another chemical called a terpene, which when combined with cannabinoids gives something called an entourage effect. I prefer to think of it as an ensemble because all of these plant chemicals together, whether they're cannabinoids, terpenoids, flavonoids, it gets complicated. And the full balanced plant evolved with humans over the last 6,000 years. This plant, however, has dominant genetics for three things. Has a lot of THC. It has a lot of a terpene called myrcene. And myrcene is unique because there are some smells that come from plants like lavender That's supposed to be relaxing. That's why it's in bath soaps, and it helps you relax. Other things can help with being calming or even sedating. Myrcene's different. Myrcene is hypnotic, which means it has an effect on memory. The lights are just not, the lights are on, but nobody's really getting the message at home. So, not surprisingly, this kind of plant, stronger pot, is associated with not necessarily top level academic performance. I guess if you're an artist and things and you have to release certain inhibitions, then it might be helpful. But this is not a plant associated with productivity. And the reason I'm pointing it out, I said there were three things unique about it. Well, the third is that it's 4 feet tall. So during the time that this plant is going through these changes, a 4 foot tall plant is easy to hide from a helicopter when you're growing it in California. So therefore, the plant started to change and got more and more concentrated over the next 50 years to where THC now can be easily over 25%. And even in more recent years, even the cannabidiol, the CBD, has started to get increased where there are some hemp varieties that bring up to 15% CBD. The point is, neither of those in a whole plant is balanced if the plant only expresses THC or predominantly only expresses CBD. It's those middle ones that are one-to-ones that I believe most of the therapeutics will fall back on, whether they're more concentrated or not. The ratio of complementary chemicals means a lot in this field. So because these are dominant traits from that plant you saw in the photograph called Afghani Kush #1, and there's another called skunk #1, these created little short indica hybrids with lots of THC and not much CBD, but certainly lots of that terpene called myrcene associated with a hypnotic state. So overall, my comment to you as a physician botanist is these unbalanced modern plants didn't devolve at all. They devolved probably from what helped more humans than right now. So associating that, this is actually some artwork that we commissioned a few years ago. And what I do is I try to point out that these are cultural leaders. They call them the fathers of medicine. I don't want you to think of that as a chauvinistic comment, but whether Chiang Kai-shek, it's Chongqing in the top left for Asian China, Hippocrates in Greece, Imhotep far before that in Egypt, and Charak, which is Ayurvedic practice of the Indian subcontinent. They all documented their findings. That's the key and why they're considered as the fathers of their respective cultures' healthcare. Recording findings is not something that happened in prehistoric times. Things got passed down by word of mouth. But these are the true academicians then, in a sense, the only one of which would consider probably to have a Western approach to things might be Hippocrates. We still give the Hippocratic Oath, and I'll show something a little bit. But what I was saying before we started speaking briefly with the Dr. Joseph is this receptor system controls everything. So I don't know if you've ever actually looked through the United States Pharmacopoeia, but it goes back over 200 years to 1820. And I will tell you from 1850 all the way up to the 1942 edition, cannabis was featured in this because it was legal and all the pharmaceutical companies were basically manufacturing it, typically in pill form or extracts with liquids, but not so much in smokable pot, but it was a regular formulary item. Except with the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, the federal government no longer kept educating on it. So that's why it's missing in the 1942 or 3 edition of this. Reason I'm bringing it up is I authored a textbook chapter last year, and the editor, who is a colleague, friend of mine, he's a botanist and pharmacist, he runs the farms at the University of Mississippi. He was born in Egypt, but he's been here for over 50 years. And for 45 of those years, the federal government has relied on his farms for all research cannabis that's gone through the federal government. So he, in essence, is the federal government's grower, not that kid in Colorado. In 2020, he published a paper with other USP, United States Pharmacopoeia participants. And it was this, I'm showing you the volume of the book there, but the article itself basically said that they should start to think about cannabis in three groups rather than what is popularly known as sativa or indica. Everything now is known to actually be forms of cannabis sativa, described in the 1750s by Carolus Linnaeus. But the important point here is Dr. El Sole also saw that many of these cultivars or chemovars predominantly express THC. I showed a slide of those that predominantly express CBD. Those are two of the groups, but the third group, the one that he's pointed out, are the ones that have approximately 1-to-1 or equal amounts of both. This is what's coming with the legalization when this hits the USP for the next edition when it comes out. And I'm pointing it out because whether USP or Hippocrates in Greece, I really wanted to start into this not only independently, but to do the right thing. I've got kids, they're just 19 now, so they're, like starting high school as I'm starting to talk publicly, but they also saw me conferring the oath of medicine to 200 new docs. And I can't tell you how many times, this is a big honor, but how many times I got asked about cannabis by my staunch, addictionologist. He says, "Oh, you should know this, Dr. Block. The Hippocratic Oath says, first, do no harm." Well, they're partly right. First, do no harm is nowhere in the Hippocratic Oath, but it is attributable to Hippocrates. And the writings that Hippocrates uses that phrase of first do no harm is another set of writings called of the epidemics. They had epidemics in ancient times, just like we had COVID. And guess what? The message there is that a physician healer should not overestimate their capacity to heal, especially in times of an epidemic when you don't have all the resources, studies completed, and things like that, nor should they underestimate their capacity to cause harm. That's where that phrase comes from. So I've tried to make myself a little bit of a student, not only of oaths, but to try to figure what would be the right bioethical platform. And we'll get to something called bioethics in just a moment. But for the meantime, in higher education at the university, docs don't get a state license. They can't practice medicine when they finish taking their oath and run out to a hospital. They first have to pass their 3 parts of the national board exams, and the DOs have a slightly different path through their COMLEX US there. So these tests are federal national tests. And guess what's not asked about on a national test if the federal government's definition has said there's no known medical use? Anything about cannabis or even the receptor system. That's about to change with the rescheduling, but I wanted to point out it's not a nefarious plot to keep doctors dumb, but it does have impact by the very definition and who's giving the tests. Now, test taking is a bitch. I know this from medical school. I know the students now, and they're very bright, all of them. But the constraints in which the US medical education programs have progressed can be dating back to the earliest of the last century. This report from the Carnegie Foundation is basically known as the Flexner Report. And what it was, and still is, it's basically taking a relatively strict Germanic way of teaching sciences. It is absolutely evidence-based. Excuse me, let me go back to this one moment. It's evidence-based, but at the same time, it very much is almost a hyper-rational system that this German science created. And it, to a certain extent, it's not very open to allowing people to think outside the box for new innovations. So this is being re-explored 100 years later. So what's a poor doc to do? And again, my bias is as a clinician. I don't really care what it does to a white research rat for cannabis. There's too much information about this already if you just observe carefully. And this doc is obviously dealing with things that I'm sure he gets questions about, the old brain-gut connection. Well, easy to explain if you understand endocannabinoids. It no longer is an elusive thing. And endocannabinoids come in 2 different kinds of receptors, CB1 and CB2, and they're drawn this way purposely as a sort of yin-yang. And those are actually molecules that are experimental ones. You can see sort of the 3D imaging of the receptors as far as the way they're shown with those little curly Q ribbon things. But those receptors have very specific binding sites, including ones that partially activate the receptor. And THC is a partial agonist of receptors, not a full agonist. And that's different. You need to understand some things about how receptors work to appreciate that THC is the fine tuner, and a second natural ligand called 2-arachidonyl glycerol, mercifully abbreviated 2AG, is actually more of a total agonist. And so I'll show you in just a minute a little video of how these do work. The purpose of endocannabinoid receptors is to maintain a balance with those things that nature throws at you: diseases, injuries, other stresses, hunger, weather type things, ice ages. Those animals, by the way, not just humans have endocannabinoids, not only mammals, not only vertebrates. This receptor system now is known to go back to invertebrates. So all of the animal kingdom uses this system to regulate and keep itself in balance with nature. If the animal fails to do that for some reason, I said it simply before, it becomes extinct. This is part of evolution. And so humans right now have just discovered this, but the controlling part of it that I had mentioned to Dr. Joseph as we were starting that's so unique is that this system activity impacts all other receptor systems that are subordinate then to the actions of cannabinoids, which is what we're looking at. When I say cannabinoids now, I mean endocannabinoids, the body's own, compared to phytocannabinoids, phyto being the word plant-derived. So unlike anandamide, and anandamide is one of the two neurotrans, not even neurotransmitters, it's a ligand to the endocannabinoid receptors. And THC and anandamide are both partial receptor agonists, partial being the key word. And it affects many areas of the brain. This is from an NIH picture from several years ago. So you can see memory, movement, judgment, reward, coordination, vision, sensations. But where you don't see it is in the brainstem. See the brainstem there? And this is a distinct neuroanatomical advantage. They're absent in the brainstem. That's why people don't stop breathing when they have huge doses of cannabis with THC in particular. So that's not the case, obviously, with opioids, but that's where breathing the drive comes from. And many other plant-derived sedative hypnotics do impact that part of the brain, but not cannabis. So does that mean nobody ever died from it? Absolutely not. Maybe not from directly not breathing, but certainly the capacity even to tolerate lots of alcohol or other opioids when coupled with this may have somebody less aware of what's going on. And certainly the awareness comes to play when driving a car, that plenty of people have killed themselves while high on pot because of falling asleep at the wheel or not just paying attention. So again, you're not going to die from stopping breathing from cannabis alone. It does do a lot of interesting things connecting the brain and the body. I've just listed a few here, but this gives you some idea also for how many receptor systems there are. This is actually 10 years ago, but they're the two, the CB1 and the CB2. Those two control everything else. And I think that's a fairly impressive position to be in for somebody who would want to know how and why. I've told you why, to preserve the balance. Now I'm going to show you how. What you see on top is a presynaptic synapse, the presynaptic side, the nerve coming in. And on the bottom is the surface of the postsynaptic surface. And you see CB1 is written on the top there. That CB1 is a CB receptor, cannabinoid receptor, on the presynaptic surface. And it's going to regulate all neurotransmission through what is called retrograde transmission. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. We were taught in medical school in my day, and I think it's still taught this way essentially, that nerve transmission goes afferent one way, efferent the other way, and it's got to get to the brain and go all the way to the toe and all the way back to the brain. No, there's actually a little feedback reverse loop that happens between every single synapse from your brain down to that hurt toe. And at that point, the cannabinoid receptors exert their effect on whatever the neurotransmitter being released is. In this case, it's listed as glutamate. Pain glutamate goes in hand. It's a good example here. But as we said before, acetylcholine, melatonin, epinephrine, all of these are balanced constantly throughout the entire body by this system. And so in essence, then, if you see at the bottom, you see a turquoise thing that says 2-AG, and next to it on the right, you see anandamide. Those are the body's two ligands that naturally are going to interact with the receptor, those two with the circles. And as the postsynaptic surface is receiving the glutamate, then that's when the body's own ligands are manufactured real time on the postsynaptic surface and travel retrograde, backwards, back to that CB1 receptor. And that's where the magic happens, because that CB1 receptor then will change the way that the neurotransmitters are released. May bump it up a little, may bring it down a little bit. That fine-tuning happens throughout the whole afferent or efferent pathway to get the job done. So I hope that that was at least impactful for you to understand a mechanism of action, which is kind of important. And remember, these are nerves. So this bouton, as they call it, from the synapse where it's wide there and interfaces below, is actually in a lipid environment. It's aqueous outside of it. But guess what? Anandamide and 2-AG are lipids. They are not alkaloids, Dr. Joseph. And that's really a cool part about this, because it has to operate within a lipid system. So
I do
actually, what's that?
I do have a question really quick, if that's okay.
You know what I'd appreciate? I know the content. I would like to get through the slides if you don't mind, and I'll be happy to entertain the questions. Just if you don't mind, jot it down, because there's a certain continuity I do want to keep with tonight's talk, and then I'm happy to entertain questions when I'm done.
You got it.
So this slide actually is something published by GW Pharmaceuticals, which has had a medicine called Sativex out that's approved in 30 different countries for the last, probably close to 15 years. They also made Epidiolex, which is pure CBD, and that's for the kids with seizures. But they did this really cool slide years ago, and what it's meant to show, I mentioned partial agonists of receptors, but there's also partial antagonists. There are things called inverse agonists. So overall, whether it's a positive receptor activity or a negative one, the idea is to maintain that physiologic balance. And I think if you watch real time how this slide progresses, I can let it keep running for a little while, but it's complicated, and yet it's wonderfully fine-tuned. Whether it's positive regulation or negative, this is what's going on everybody on this call right now, real time, all the time, to stay alive, and in every animal. So these receptors then can be activated in a neutral, positive, negative way, partially or full agonist is what it says on top. All of these variables are what allow you to stay so fine-tuned. So now the politics just for a little bit. This is as of January. These are the states that say it's legal only for medical, illegal totally, or decriminalize the D. Yet this is a map of the United States. And while I said that California was the first state to go into federal prohibition, in 1996, which was barely 4 years after the study and the discovery of those two natural ligands, which was in the early 1990s, by 1996, California became the first state to take it out of prohibition. And that's 24 years ago, 28 years ago. So considering it took from about 1910 to 1937, over a quarter century to go in, it's not surprising that it's taken about that long to come out, and it's imminent now. But it's imminent because of what we have, a political system where that map actually has a certain way of being presented based on population. So now you're looking at where the voting masses come from and the legislators and everything else that goes along with it. It's a popular thing to get out of prohibition right now. The question is how far out. So I hope you've gotten some of this so far, but there's some basic core things that I can tell you now that will just hopefully be simple enough to make sense, including what ancient healers did as they shared wisdom, even before those written scribes of the four leaders and the fathers of their respective cultures. The Eastern sentiment about health wellness was generationally shared. And so along those lines, I want to jump forward now and backwards at the same time in just a moment. This is a PET scan from 2013. And if you look closely to the left side, you'll see by the hand there's a little red spot. That's an intravenous site. And what was done is a radioisotope labeled ligand was injected in, and 2 hours later, this was the PET scan taken, where that ligand is now showing where CB2 receptors are. CB1 receptors, we said before, are largely in the brain, but CB2 receptors are in the body associated with the immune system cell lineage, and they're there for a reason. And the reason that they are there is, as I said, CB receptors are there to mitigate the consequences of diseases and injuries. So if you look at old cultures, I can go back, in this case, over 1,500 years. This is an old acupuncture chart. And anybody who knows acupuncture knows that the gut, the belly, is where the life is. That's where chi is. And so life is associated in the concept way with acupuncture that chi is flow and life. And nowadays, with that PET scan, hey, look where it is. Health now we associated with a good immune system and long life. But what I'm showing you here is sort of Western medicine's new science future meets Eastern medicine's traditional way they look at this. And that's what integrative medicine really is. So it's a cross-cultural, hopefully, gleaning of the best that each cultures know about health and wellness. So I want to point out now with receptors that really only since my time from college on have these three systems, endorphins, endocannabinoids, and then endovaniloids, been described. These are the receptor systems in the primary three that determine pain. And I want to say this too. Pain is not always physical. Pain is not a diagnosis for anything. It's a symptom of many diseases and injuries. And as such, those who are so constrained to think about pain as only being physical don't realize that patients will self-medicate for intolerable symptoms that are psychological and even spiritual, if you know people who may be upset that way. So the point is that endorphins, endocannabinoids, which is 1992, and then endovaniloids, the chili pepper, all of these discoveries for receptor systems work together so that pain in a healthy person should not be so overwhelming as to be intolerable. Nevertheless, I want to point out a medicine, again, when cannabis was legal, this was Park Davis, before 1937, that was the magic year that things stopped. And yet this is chlorodyne. These were pills in there. And it was not simply cannabis or not simply an opioid, but when you use small amounts from these three different systems rather than the full complement from either one alone, you tend to mitigate the side effects of larger doses of opioids or cannabinoids, or in that case, even endovaniloids. And guess what's in here? Morphine, cannabis, and capsaicin. That then they didn't know, but now we do know. It works through these three principal receptor systems. And yes, it was well documented and effective for pain, but there were plenty of times where people swallowed a whole bottle and killed themselves. So it's more of the same, but I wanted to point out that this was common formulary around the turn of the last century. So let's get right into this now, because this is where I like to tell you that for myself, kids, being associated with the University of Miami, I think, is blessed in that we have the longest standing department of ethics of any medical school in the country. And we're only 60 something years old, but I'm here. It's where I was president of our alumni association, and I sort of know the talent that's been there. And so I wanted, and I sought help figuring the answer to this question. Should a physician offer compassionate access to cannabis use as a medicine while it remains under federal prohibition? And we all said, oh, well, let's go check, what the AMA says, or medical legal ethics. And the AMA is pretty clear what it says. And it says a physician shall respect the law and also recognize a responsibility to seek changes in those requirements that are contrary to the best interests of the patient. Well, it sounds good. But the fact is, when physicians have two licenses, a license to practice medicine in whichever state they're licensed, and a federal DEA license, which is their privilege and responsibility to prescribe, and cannabis is in the crosshairs and different in that respect, medical legal ethics has gone nowhere on this subject for that simple reason. And so, yes, you can fault the medical establishment, the legal establishment is part of it, but there are certain discoveries that happen in science that require a different approach. Sometimes, if you've heard of what bioethics are, those are ethics positions which are looked at not just with doctors and lawyers, but with the full community, meaning law enforcement, clergy, educators, yes, doctors and lawyers, patients, everybody. And so coming up with a bioethical statement about cannabis shouldn't be too hard for a healer in particular who should be a good observer. And so bioethics then is also the way that the original dealing with the consequence of modern science had to deal with atomic energy and the bomb. We're going to use it for energy too, a good and a bad thing. To get into that science requires a bioethical discussion. So it's not just left up to certain people. Stem cells develop the same way. If anybody remembers George Bush 1, when stem cells were first coming out, restricted the research lines to things thinking probably that, oh, we're going to create a Frankenstein. No, think about a bioethical conversation and discussion evolving to where thousands and thousands of people are alive today because of advances in stem cell research and development. So for cannabis, I wanted to come up with a statement on the basis of how patients and why patients use not simply cannabis, but medicinal substances, and animals will self-soothe. So what we've come up with is seeking relief from the intolerable physical, psychological, or spiritual symptoms or injuries or diseases. It's instinctive. It contributes to medicinal substances use and abuse. But then again, if that's an irrefutable statement, what about an irrefutable statement for the perspective of the healer? Well, the treatment of intolerable symptoms is a noble task that society bestows upon its healers to provide humane relief. I've taken those two sentences and not been summarily rejected or ostracized at my institution, which after 10 years is, I think, on the right path. So, public health, because you can't get past the consequences of this. And so I wanted to point out, we talked about the tobacco plant earlier, but if you see there, smoking is by far the leading cause of preventable death. And this study dates back to 2004, when drug abuse was the 9th most frequent cause, way out there to the right. Well, guess what? Tobacco smoking is down. That's a public health victory, and a significant one over the last 20 years. But over the last 15 years, lethal opioid overdoses, whether with the OxyContin or fentanyl now, have pushed that drug abuse over 15 years to 2019 past motor vehicle accidents. And I would venture to say, with fentanyl deaths on top of that, perhaps past toxins, probably not past infectious diseases because of COVID, but these dynamics of changes of what are the primary preventable causes of death is really germane right now, because it's sort of drugs interface with tobacco and we're trying to fine tune things, but make no doubt about it, drug abuse is up, as is the industry that would like to get behind cannabis because, well, it involves many different types of people and there is money there. So analyzing its contributions versus cost versus benefits to public health is something right now that's being looked at very carefully state to state. Hopefully, the federal government will get control of this to where one state doesn't try to outdo the next to see how far they can push this. So doctors are sort of, again, stuck in the middle, not on the tightrope, but in this case, on the wrong side of that horse. And so in this case, you have anecdotal reports and stakeholder bias that are using the cart to pull the horse that I've listed here as the evidence-based data and the reason. So moving on to the reason, I just want to bring this one quote up because I'm going to say it. Without some common baseline of facts, without a willingness to admit new information and concede that your opponent's making a fair point and that science and reason matter, we'll keep talking past each other, making common ground and compromise impossible. So in 2017, the same year, actually the same month that statement was made, the federal government published the publication on the right there. That's from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And in 1999, what was then called the Institutes of Health did a similar presentation on marijuana and medicine, but that was barely 6 years after the discovery of the body's own chemicals. So the study from January of 2017 on the right was very important because it was a meta-analysis of over how many thousands? 26,000 different articles. They selected 100 studies that met a very stringent criteria, and they published their findings to find that, yes, there were a few things that actually worked for. This
Mr.
is
Surgeon General, while we have you here, I want to get you on the record about whether you support the legalization of marijuana and what concerns you have.
Well, marijuana is an interesting story that's unfolding in our country right now. And we have, had a long history of discussion around the benefits and risks of marijuana. We have experiments that are going on in many states right now where medical marijuana has been legalized, and in at least a few states where it has been legalized even for recreational use.
We know all of that. We want to know your position, Mr. Surgeon General, with all due respect.
Yes, well, my position is that we have to see what the science tells us about the efficacy of marijuana. And I think we're going to get a lot more data on that. We have some preliminary data showing that for certain medical conditions and symptoms, that marijuana can be helpful. So I think that we have to use that data to drive policymaking. And I'm very interested to see where that data takes us.
Dr. Vivek Murthy, we thank you for doing your first live interview with us here on CBS. Good to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
So they have him doing his first live interview because he's brand new to the job. Remember that the Surgeon Generals of the United States are political appointees. They generally serve 4 years. Dr. Murthy is unique in two ways. First of all, he's the first two-time Surgeon General. He was also under Obama. In just a moment, I'll show you Donald Trump's Surgeon General for comments, entirely valid comments. But there were two things about Dr. Murthy I wanted to point out. One was that he was a two-time Surgeon General, and the other is that he was a valedictorian from my little high school down here in Miami. His parents are still doctors in this community. So whether or not you agree with his party or anything else, or even what he said here in 2015, which is before that 2017 National Academies meta-analysis was released, he said the right thing at the right time. And I'll show you an update for that, what he said more recently. Nevertheless, these are all the Surgeon Generals since 1970, and you could see by the color of their numbers, if they are pro is green, red is con, and blue is not really clear on their position at all. Only one had no position found, but I'm pointing out that all of these Surgeon Generals, particularly the last few, have had not any clear direction for the rest of us to take. That's why this is so important that it's changing now. So you can see in the bottom right, Jerome Adams, who happens to be an anesthesiologist, wasn't clearly pro or con, but he too was asked about this shortly after the 2017 study came out. But now a different thing is happening to cannabis. It's getting more and more concentrated. So that's interesting too. This is where in the world it's legal to, and the rest of the world is waiting for the United States. World Health Organization, the United Nations Convention on Drugs, they will all follow in line with what comes out of the US reclassification. So this is that study, and I want to just point out a very brief summary of those things that came out of this study. It's not too many things you have to see here. Chemotherapy is the only thing that actually has conclusive evidence-based data. This study categorized things as either having conclusive, substantial, moderate, poor, or no evidence-based data. And so in classifying it that way, I'm going to tell you that the things that are the top four here, the top three, and then CBD, but particularly the top three, have either conclusive or substantial evidence-based data, including chronic pain. And that's where a lot of the misuse probably comes in. So moving then along to the National Academy's recommendations in this report, this is what they said really needs to be done. And it takes time. There are very few longitudinal studies too, that is really key to this. So developing a comprehensive evidence-based plan, short-term, long-term, conclusive evidence on the short-term health effects, ensure that sufficient data is available, which is very challenging under prohibition. And then it says create a committee of experts tasked with an objective and evidence-based report. That's really what came out of that January 2017 study. And so they're interested in more studies like that because they did feel it was fair and balanced. Here's Dr. Adams.
Very, very concerned, as Surgeon General, at how far and how fast we're going on marijuana in this country. Very concerned. You know, number one, this isn't your mother's marijuana. Marijuana a decade ago was 5% THC, single digits THC. You now have professionally grown strains that are 20, 30% THC, and then they're concentrating them into oils, into waxes. They're vaping them, they're dabbing them, they're shatter, and you're getting 90, 95% THC. It's like the difference between you having a glass of wine and a pint of grain alcohol. It literally is. And so we've normalized this idea of marijuana use across the country way too fast, to the point that in communities in California, there's 1 in 5 pregnant women, 20% of pregnant women reporting that they are using marijuana during pregnancy. Youth attitudes are changing about marijuana across the country. And I want you to hear me say this as the nation's doctor. There is no such thing as medical marijuana. And I see some eyebrows raised out there. We don't talk about medical foxglove. We don't talk about medical opium. There is no other substance out there that, as a physician, we say grow it in your backyard, crumble it up, bake it into a brownie, or roll it into a cigarette and smoke it, and that's going to be good for whatever ails you. There are over 100 components of marijuana, some of them which have medicinal properties and medicinal promise, and we need to make sure we push for the research so that we can say to each individual, this component has been proven to be beneficial for your disease, and here are the risks and the benefits.
Okay, so Pericles here, as a toxicologist and the father of modern pharmacy, is famous for saying that the dose defines a poison. Remember, if you had too much oxygen or water, it can actually cause horrible effects. Too much water can kill you. So his comments about dosing is entirely appropriate, because in medical programs, I'm not so sure there's no such thing as medical marijuana. There are medical uses for marijuana, certainly, but even the term itself, marijuana, has such slang and connotations associated with it that he probably would be better to use the word cannabis, but it's written into US laws, the Marijuana Tax Act. So that's why that word gets carried down politically. Anyway, here's Dr. Murthy again.
Chuck Schumer introduced legislation this week to decriminalize marijuana at the federal level. From a health perspective, do you support that?
Well, when it comes to marijuana, then I think we have to let science guide us. And we know that the science tells us that there are some benefits for marijuana from a medical perspective, but there are also some harms that we have to consider, and we have to put those together as we think about the right policy. Now, when it comes to decriminalization, I don't think that there is value to individuals or to society to lock people up for marijuana use. I don't think that serves anybody well. But I do think that in terms of our approach to marijuana, I worry when we don't let science guide our process and policymaking. And in a Surgeon General, that's my role, is to work with policymakers, to work with members in the community and the general public to help people understand what science tells us and where we have gaps to help fill those gaps with research and with honest inquiry.
Dr. Vivek Murthy, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Appreciate it.
So that comment is more recent and came at a time shortly after the Biden administration tasked their Health and Human Services Secretary to look at cannabis again and turn that information over to the DEA, which happened several months ago. And only about a month ago, the DEA came back and announced that it was planning to have it rescheduled to Schedule 3 as a controlled substance. It seems like a small step, but it's hugely important. So where are we in Florida? Well, I'm down here at the University of Miami. Today's June 10th, but at the University of Florida is where most of the agricultural research goes. As good as we are down here for the ethics and the other medical school research we do, agriculture is really the hub. UF in Gainesville is the hub for agriculture, so they have a big role in researching cannabis here in the state that I'm from. I have authored 4 chapters in these 3 textbooks, the last one of which just came out last month on the right. And invite you to read whatever you want. But the fact is, not many people read textbooks. I don't make royalties on any of these things, but at least it let me organize my thoughts. That's really summarily come right down to this. There has to be a take-home message. And if you see this joint with the seductive little figure there, I can't quite tell what that is. But my point in being seductive is there's a take-home message here that little seductive temptation and indulgence offers us choices. And those of you that are familiar with the genie in the bottle parable, that genie gives you a few wishes, right? The 2, and then the third one's the gotcha one. So that's what I think we're at now in terms of something that's a temptation and indulgence, even in terms of the way doctors might look at it for maybe the miraculous things it'll do. Going back to that first slide, therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans. Well, we're quite a ways away from that yet. There's a whole generation or 2 of meaningful research to try to harness mostly what CB2 receptors do. And so this caution comes at a cost because science and reason matter. So that's the reason I wanted to conclude with this. This is the way you can reach me. And so, Dr. Joseph, other questions, I'm happy to entertain them now.
Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Block. And again, I really liked how you put it into perspective as it's, this is something that's involved with all of the different receptors. When we were talking about the nicotinic receptors, this is sort of a master regulator. That was the term I used. And it's good to have a perspective like that, because then you kind of know where things stand in the hierarchy. But my specific question was on the glutamate receptor, actually. And the reason is because recently we had been having a discussion about a patient or patients who have anti-glutamate antibodies. It's actually anti-NMDA receptor antibody encephalopathy or encephalitis. And they present, without getting into the details, like an atypical Parkinson's, or they could present as psychotic. They can present as having choreic movements followed by stiffness. And it's all about the fact that the immune system is attacking those receptors. And when you showed that slide of the synapse showing those receptors being activated, and then there's this feedback loop of these lipid-liking CBD molecules, I guess, or cannabis, or no, endocannabinoid.
Yeah, try not to think about it relative to cannabis. Because I in that slide, it showed THC coming in from an independent source. It was green colored in the slide. I won't pull it back up. But cannabis is very different than the body's own ligands for 2 main reasons. Number one, it is nowhere near as specific in real time that the endogenous receptors are. And number two, it is prolonged, much, much longer duration of action than the natural ligands ever thought of being. So cannabis is a sledgehammer compared to the endocannabinoids. And with THC being a partial agonist and anandamide is that one molecule I told you is also a partial agonist. I'll give you a little other insight to the word anandamide, because that's not the chemical name. That's a name given to that molecule by its discoverers. And this dates back to the early 1990s. It means, it's a Sanskrit word. It means bliss, balance. Again, trying to tell you what those first researchers really appreciated that it's there for. When you have a partial agonist, it's always fine-tuning more than the one that's the total on or off. So THC and anandamide are partial agonists, and actually CBD, since you just mentioned it, is not a direct agonist of the receptor at all. It's a negative allosteric modulator of the receptor, but it doesn't directly interface with the receptor. And so these chemicals work in different ways on different parts of the body. And each of the cannabinoids, and I've only mentioned THC and CBD, there's well over 100 different cannabinoids. And not only have most of them not been fully explored, but the plant produces them in an acid form that with heating changes it to be that which you're taking, THC. So the plant's producing something called THCA or CBD-A, where the A is acid. Heating causes decarboxylation and then turns it into the active moiety for something that's intoxicating. The cool thing is, even the acid forms have their own unique biochemistry when taken by humans, but once you ingest it, it heats up too. But combustion is a very quick way to decarboxylate and get that acid off of the plant's molecule. So it's a very dynamic process, Dr. Joseph, and yet CBD is unique. It is not something that works like THC, but CBD tends to mitigate some of the side effects of THC. So if you see a naive user try THC for the first time, not infrequently, it's a bad trip. It elicits some paranoia, fear. It's a very dysphoric experience for many people. However, I said CBD before can be a great anxiolytic. When you put them together and they're taken in balance, you tend to avoid a lot of the side effects associated with THC. THC has another side effect we talked about earlier about memory impairment, coupled with that myrcene terpenoid I said is hypnotic. Well, there's another terpene in nature called pinene. It's the most frequent smell in nature, pine. And the Japanese have known for centuries about the mind-clearing benefits of taking a walk in the forest. So if you put pinene in with plants that have THC, removing some of that myrcene, it actually counteracts some of the memory impairment found from the THC part itself. So the way the plant's chemicals in balance interface with animals is fascinating to me. And I'm trying to share these little tidbits with you because if you go to the dispensing points now throughout the United States, it's very hard to find things that are not THC concentrates loaded with myrcene that are all a direct consequence of the dominant genetics of those early plants from the 1970s. It's just gets more and more concentrated. And remember, I said that these percentages are measured by dry weight. Do you know what a horticultural feat it is to have a single secondary metabolite weigh 1/4 the whole weight of that flower? It's really quite remarkable with generations of breeding by active and avid horticulturists over the last probably 35 to 45 years. And it's changed the plant into something entirely unnatural.
Well, I guess,
Dr.
go ahead, Dr. Klatz.
Yeah, hi, Ron Klatz here. Wanted to thank you. Really good presentation. I think it's fascinating and I think it's very timely. And I loved what you had to say about, nothing's a poison until you have ghosts. And that's what I've been saying all along at the very beginning, all the, the negative press and pushback we had against from the establishment of anti-aging medicine. I said, well, if it's so dangerous, show me the bodies, show me how the bodies are stacked up like cordwood. Of course, there were none. But somehow anti-aging was a dangerous and scary maneuver because there wasn't enough research. Well, hell, there's never going to be enough research. But over the past 35 years, anti-aging has proven itself because it works and people do so well. I think the same can be said with horticultural medicine, especially with marijuana. And while I agree with you that the artificial agricultural around CBD may be problematic, I think that the good outweighs the bad, and that there are millions and millions and millions of people who are helped with pain and anxiety and spasm and many other problems by having easy access to marijuana, whereas they don't have easy access to drugs, except for maybe illicit drugs. And I would much rather see the public abuse marijuana than abuse fentanyl or the other, drugs that are on the black market. But thank you, very, very good presentation, and I just think there's a lot more to be said about this, and I wish there was more in the way of actual pharmacology or pharmacy out there for the proper use of this product.
I think that Dr. El Sole from the University of Mississippi's categorizing this into 3 researchable groups, lots with THC, some with lots of CBD, but those one-to-ones, the way that I think it makes best sense to start someone if you're going to try. Obviously, it's the lowest effective dose for any medication that you start with. So there's a popular saying that's called start low, go slow. It's very hard to do with all the concentrates that are out there. It's nearly impossible to do. So I think as practitioners learn what they're learning, those on the call tonight, some of you may have a decent understanding of how this works, but most of the doctors I encounter here in my home state, I was just in Orlando addressing 150 of them last weekend. And it was for CMEs as well, so a high quality education. Most of them really don't understand the subject. Maybe they went into this as a retirement path, or maybe didn't do so well in something else, or maybe they remember it fondly when they were kids and still do it. There's a lot of things that make me wonder at times with respect to plant chemicals in particular, which is in control of the other. The chemicals in the plant controlling the user, or the user controlling the chemical. That's where a doctor's supervision and guidance through this, I think, is still essential, which is why